The grease was popping when she reached for the cornmeal. No recipe card, no measuring cup, just hands that remembered. Black grandmothers in the deep South carried dishes no cookbook ever held, and most left when they did. Here are 30 deep South recipes only black grandmothers over 70 still remember. Salmon croquettes came out of a pink can and landed in a cast iron skillet, and in every black kitchen from Mississippi to Memphis, the sound of them frying meant somebody's grandmother was home. She drained the canned salmon, picked through the bones, though some left them in, mashed right into the mix for calcium, and that's how you knew she'd been doing this long before you were born. The salmon was folded with egg, crushed saltines, diced onion and black pepper, shaped into patties by feel. Fried golden until the edges crisped, they came out smelling like Friday night in a house where money was short, but food never was. Canned salmon cost less than fresh meat and kept without refrigeration, making it the protein that fed the Great Migration north. Served with grits or white bread, hot sauce on the side, nobody's recipe matched because nobody's grandmother mixed hers the same way twice. The croquette survived her, the way it tasted didn't. Crackling bread showed up every year when the hog was killed, and if you grew up in the deep South before the 1970s, you can still hear the crunch. Cracklings, the crispy bits of pork skin left after rendering lard, were folded into cornmeal batter with salt and a little water, then baked in a greased skillet until the outside turned hard and golden. The bread came out dense, rich and smoky, nothing like anything from a box. During hog killing season, usually late November when the air turned cold enough to keep meat from spoiling, every piece of the animal found purpose, and the cracklings were the cook's reward. WPA narratives from formerly enslaved people describe crackling bread as a plantation staple, and it carried forward into free households without needing a name change. It was poor people's bread that tasted richer than anything money could buy. Smothered cabbage with smoked meat was Tuesday night supper, Thursday night supper, sometimes every night when the paycheck ran thin and a head of cabbage cost next to nothing. The cabbage was cored, sliced thick, and dropped into a heavy pot with smoked turkey legs or whatever cured pork was in the house, often just a ham hock end left from Sunday. Onions went in first, sweated in bacon drippings, then the cabbage piled on top, seasoned with garlic powder, black pepper, red pepper flakes, and a splash of vinegar. Covered tight and cooked low for close to an hour, the leaves broke down into something silky, soaked through with smoky broth until every bite tasted slow cooked. It was a full meal for the price of one vegetable and a leftover bone. Kids ate it, kids, without complaint because there was nothing else and because it was actually good, and grown folks ate it because their mothers had made it the same way in the same kind of pot without ever once checking a recipe. If you had to ask what tomato gravy was, you weren't from the Delta. Across the Black Belt of Alabama and the Mississippi Delta, tomato gravy over white rice was breakfast before church and supper after a long shift. The gravy started with bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred until it darkened, just past blonde, then canned tomatoes, crushed by hand and poured in. Salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, and enough water to thin it into something that poured but still clung to a spoon. It bubbled low while the rice steamed, always long grain, always cooked until each grain stood alone. The color told you everything. Too pale meant the roux wasn't ready. Too dark meant you'd walked away. And in those kitchens, you did not walk away from the stove. Poured hot over rice in a shallow bowl, it cost almost nothing and filled you until noon the next day. Before those dishes hit the table, something simpler was already simmering on the back burner. Stewed tomatoes and okra, cooked together in one pot the way West African women had done for centuries, before their recipes crossed the Atlantic. Okra came to the American South through the transatlantic slave trade, carried in the memory of enslaved people who knew its value as both food and thickener. The dish was nothing complicated: fresh okra sliced into rounds, tomatoes chopped rough or a can of whole ones when the season passed, onion, garlic, salt, and pepper all simmered in cast iron until the okra released its silk and the tomatoes broke down into a thick, tangy stew. Some added salt pork for depth, others kept it meatless and let the vegetables speak. In the 1940s and 50s, this was a garden-to-table meal long before anyone used that phrase: grown out back, picked that morning, cooked by lunchtime. It fed without asking much in return. Chowchow relish sat in mason jars on the top shelf of the pantry, and you knew a woman by the color of hers. Made from the last of the garden: green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, bell peppers, sometimes hot peppers if the family liked heat. The vegetables were chopped fine, salted overnight, then cooked down in vinegar with mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric until the kitchen smelled sharp enough to water your eyes. Every jar was different because every garden was different and every grandmother seasoned by instinct. In the rural Deep South through the 1960s, Chowchow was preservation itself, a way to keep summer alive through January. Spooned over beans, peas, greens, or eaten straight with bread, it added a tangy, sweet bite that cut through the heaviness of winter cooking. The tradition ran deep in Black households. Across the Carolinas and Alabama, a woman who didn't put up her chowchow by October was talked about at church. Crackling cornbread was the dressed-up cousin of crackling bread. Same cracklings, but stirred into a proper batter with buttermilk and egg, then baked until the top cracked and the bottom crust turned dark against the cast iron. The skillet had to be preheated with lard until it smoked, and the batter had to sizzle the second it hit the pan. That's how you got the crust, and the crust was everything. The cracklings inside gave each bite a burst of salt and pork fat that plain cornbread couldn't touch. Hog killing day in the Deep South from the 1930s through the 60s was an all-hands event. Men handled the slaughter while women rendered lard, made sausage, and baked this bread to feed the workers. The cracklings had to go into the batter while still warm, or they turned chewy and lost their bite. That timing was the secret nobody wrote down. She stood at the counter with a sharp knife and a paper bag full of ears, cutting the kernels off close to the cob, then scraping the blade back down to get the milk. That milky starch was the whole point of fried corn, and without it, you just had corn in a pan. The kernels went into a hot skillet with bacon grease, salt, pepper, and sometimes a spoonful of sugar depending on who was cooking. Stirred low and slow until the corn thickened into something creamy. Fried corn turned a plain supper into something people remembered. Across the Deep South through the 1950s, fresh corn season meant this dish appeared at every meal. You couldn't rush it. The corn had to caramelize slowly, and the difference between golden and scorched was about 30 seconds, and a woman who never once set a timer. Pig ear sandwiches turned a part of the hog that most people wouldn't look at twice into something worth standing in line for. The ears were scrubbed, simmered for hours in seasoned water until the cartilage softened, then sliced thin or left in larger pieces depending on the cook. Some fried the slices until crispy at the edges. Others served them straight from the pot, still warm and slippery with gelatin, piled onto white bread with hot sauce, mustard, and dill pickles. In Black communities across the Deep South, pig ears were sold at juke joints, corner stores, and roadside stands from the 1940s through the 70s, often wrapped in wax paper and eaten standing up. The texture was unlike anything else: chew that gave way to tenderness, skin that crisped under heat, fat that melted on the tongue. This started with the cuts that plantation kitchens discarded, and black cooks turned refusal into ritual. Butter beans, cooked low with salt pork, simmered all afternoon while the house filled with the smell so heavy it pressed against the walls. The beans, large, flat, pale, green when fresh, went into a pot with a thick piece of salt pork, water just to cover, and maybe a bay leaf. The salt from the pork did the seasoning, and the fat melted into the broth until it turned silky and almost white. In the Deep South, from the 1940s through the 60s, butter beans grew in every garden that had a fence to climb, and shelling them on the porch was summer itself. Kids with a bowl between their knees while their grandmother told stories they half listened to and would give anything to hear again. The beans cooked down soft enough to mash against the roof of your mouth, and the broth was sipped from the bowl like soup. Nobody shells butter beans on the porch anymore. That's the part that hurts worse than the recipe being gone. Years before butter beans made it to the holiday table, something older was already cooking in the same skillet. Kush, a dish with roots reaching back to Senegambia, made from crumbled day-old cornbread fried with onions, salt, and red pepper. The name traveled the Atlantic. Food historian Michael Twitty documented Kush as one of the clearest surviving links between West African grain dishes and the cornmeal rations enslaved people received on American plantations. Across Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Carolinas, Kush was working people's food, quick to make from leftovers, filling enough to carry a man through a morning in the field. The cornbread was broken apart by hand, tossed into a hot skillet with rendered fat, then stirred with chopped onion until everything crisped and browned. Some versions added broth to soften it. Others kept it dry and crunchy. By the 1970s, the dish was slipping from kitchens, and most people under 50 have never heard the word. Persimmon pudding appeared after the first hard frost, and not a day before, because the women who made it knew what cold did to the fruit, turned it from bitter and mouth-puckering to honey-sweet and soft as jam. Wild persimmons grew along fence rows and creek banks across the Deep South, and gathering them was children's work, shaking branches and catching fruit in old feed sacks. The pulp was pressed through a colander to remove seeds, then mixed with flour, eggs, milk, butter, cinnamon, and nutmeg, and baked slow until it set into a dense, dark custard that tasted nothing like any store-bought dessert. In rural Alabama, Georgia, and the Mississippi Hill Country, persimmon pudding was autumn carried to church suppers and Thanksgiving tables with the kind of pride that didn't need decoration. The trees are still standing, but the women who knew which ones bore the sweetest fruit and exactly when the frost had done its work, they're gone, and nobody marked the trees after them. Smothered chicken wings in onion gravy were what happened when a woman had 10 mouths to feed and only a pack of wings to do it with. The wings were seasoned hard: salt, black pepper, garlic powder, paprika, dredged in flour and fried until the skin crackled. But they never came out dry. Thick sliced onions went into the same pan, cooked in the drippings until golden, then flour and broth turned everything into a dark, clinging gravy. The wings sat in it for another 30 minutes on low heat. By the time the lid came off, the meat was falling from the bone. In the 1950s and 60s, wings were the cheapest cut in the poultry case, and black grandmothers bought them by the tray. Smothering turned what nobody wanted into the dish everybody fought over, and the woman who could make gravy dark enough to stain a spoon owned that kitchen. Pig feet stew was not the pickled version, sitting cold in a jar. This was the other one, the one that took all day. Fresh pig feet, split by the butcher and scrubbed until the skin squeaked, went into a heavy pot with onions, carrots, potatoes, and water to cover. Bay leaf, thyme, salt, and black pepper, and the pot sat on the stove for 4 to 5 hours, barely simmering until the feet gave up everything: collagen, fat, and a broth so thick it set like jelly when it cooled. The meat pulled off in soft strips, and the gelatin coated the inside of your mouth. In Black households from the 1940s through the 70s, pig feet were pennies a pound, and that stew stretched $1 into a week. Grandmothers served it in deep bowls with white rice. She's been gone 20 years, and those grandchildren still haven't found a broth that rich. If smothered dishes demanded patience, ash cakes demanded something older: fire itself and the knowledge of how to cook inside it. Ash cakes were cornmeal and water, sometimes salt, mixed into dough and wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, then buried directly in the hot ashes of a hearth fire. WPA slave narratives describe formerly enslaved people recounting this as their primary bread, cooked without a pan, without an oven, with nothing but flame and hands that understood heat. The leaves kept the dough from burning while steam built inside, and when pulled from the coals, the cake had a smoky, charred crust and a dense interior that tasted like cornmeal and wood smoke. By the 1950s, most Black households had proper stoves, and ash cakes slipped from daily bread to memory. The women who remembered making them never stopped talking about the taste, and no oven-baked cornbread ever came close. Poke salad could kill you if you didn't know what you were doing, and that's exactly why only the old women picked it. Pokeweed grew wild across the Deep South, along fence lines, ditch banks, and field edges, and in early spring, the young shoots pushed up tender. But every part of the mature plant was poisonous, and even the young leaves had to be boiled twice, drained each time before they were safe. The water ran purple the first round, lighter the second, and only then did the greens go into a skillet with bacon drippings, onion, and salt. The finished dish was silky, bitter, and unmistakable. In Black communities through the 1960s, gathering poke was spring ritual, and the women who knew which leaves to pick carried knowledge no book could teach. That knowledge died with them, and the poke kept growing without anyone left who trusted it enough to eat. Every country store in the Deep South had a shelf of sardine tins, and every Black man over 60 can tell you exactly how his father ate them, standing up, can peel back, crackers in the other hand, hot sauce already shaken in. Sardines and crackers was not a meal anyone bragged about. It was what you ate when the garden was empty and the next paycheck was 3 days away. The tins cost a dime and kept forever. The crackers were saltines, always saltines, used to scoop the fish straight from the can. Some men added onion slices, others squeezed a lemon. But the hot sauce was not optional. It cut through the oil and made the whole thing taste like something you'd chosen rather than settled for. Kids watched their fathers eat sardines and swore they'd never touch them. Then they grew up, stood at the same counter, and found themselves missing the man who showed them how. Syrup cake was what women baked when there was no sugar in the house and the ribbon cane was already pressed. In the sugarcane parishes of Louisiana and the cane-growing regions of Alabama and Mississippi, ribbon cane syrup, thick, dark, and smoky sweet, replaced white sugar in everything, but nowhere more beautifully than in cake. The batter was simple: flour, eggs, lard, baking soda, spices, and a full cup of cane syrup that turned the crumb dark amber and gave it a flavor deeper than any sugar cake could manage. Baked in cast iron, it came out dense, moist, and slightly sticky at the edges. Served plain, without frosting, because the syrup inside was sweet enough. Through the 1940s and 50s, Syrup cake showed up at church homecomings and funerals, carried in cloth-covered dishes. The last woman who made it right never measured the syrup. She poured until the batter turned the color she remembered from her own mother's kitchen. If you knew what streakoline was, you grew up in a certain kind of house. It was salt-cured pork side meat, not bacon, not fatback, but the in-between cut with streaks of lean running through layers of fat. Sliced thin and fried until the fat rendered and the edges turned crisp, streakoline was breakfast with biscuits, supper with gravy, and sometimes the only meat in the house for a week. The rendered, drippings, flavored, beans, greens, and anything else that needed richness. Across rural Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi during the 1940s and 50s, streakoline was sold at the general store, sliced to order, and the amount you bought told the storekeeper how your week was going. 2 biscuits and red-eye gravy, it carried a man through 10 hours of work. That cut has all but vanished from meat counters, and the name went with it. After all the pork and pantry staples, the Deep South kitchen had another protein that didn't cost a dime: the rabbit running through the yard. Rabbit stew was small game cooking at its finest, and in black communities from the Gullah Geechee coast to the Mississippi Hill Country, it connected hunting skill to kitchen skill in a single pot. The rabbit was skinned, jointed, soaked in salted water, then browned before going into a pot with onions, potatoes, and in Gullah homes along the Carolina coast, sliced okra that thickened the broth the same way West African cooks had thickened stews for centuries. The meat simmered until it fell apart and the gravy turned dark and silky. Rabbit was leaner than pork and more available than beef, and a single animal fed a household when stretched with vegetables. By the 1980s, fewer grandmothers knew how to dress a rabbit, and the stew went quiet along with the skills that made it. Dirty rice got its name from the color, that murky brown that came from chicken livers and gizzards cooked down until they fell apart and stained every grain. In Louisiana's Black Creole kitchens, dirty rice was built on the trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper, sautéed with chopped organ meats until everything broke into a coarse, savory paste. Cooked rice was folded in, absorbing the dark juices until each grain carried the taste of the whole pot. Cayenne, black pepper, and garlic gave it heat, and the organ meats gave it a depth that plain rice never had. The dish traveled from Cajun country into black kitchens across the Deep South during the 1940s and 50s, where it became both a weeknight staple and a church supper favorite that could feed 20 from a single pot. The secret was cooking the livers until they crumbled, not sliced, not chunked, but mashed into the rice until you couldn't tell where the meat ended and the grain began. That's what made it dirty. That's what made it good. Fried green tomatoes with white gravy happened at the end of the garden, when the last tomatoes on the vine would never ripen and the first chill had come through. The tomatoes were sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried in bacon grease until the crust turned golden and the inside stayed firm and taut. But in Black Deep South kitchens, they didn't stop there. Cream gravy was made in the same skillet, flour into the drippings, milk poured slow, salt and pepper, and a scrape of the pan to pull up every cornmeal bit that had stuck and browned. That gravy went over the tomatoes, over rice, over everything. The tautness cutting through the richness was a combination. No restaurant has matched, because the restaurant doesn't use the same grease the bacon cooked in that morning. The last tomatoes of the season deserved the best cooking, and they always got it. New Year's morning in a Black Deep South household started with one question: did somebody put the jowl on? Hog jowl and black-eyed peas was not the ham hock version from cookbooks. The jowl was fattier, richer, with a chew that said it came from the face of the hog, cured and smoked like bacon, sliced thick and simmered whole with the peas. The tradition said peas meant coins and greens meant money, and the jowl was the luck. Peas soaked overnight, cooked low with jowl, onion, garlic, and pepper until the broth thickened and the meat fell apart. Served over rice with hot sauce and cornbread, it was the first meal of the year. The grandmothers who insisted on jowl instead of ham hock never explained why. If you had to ask, you weren't ready to cook it. The cracklings were still warm when she reached for the sugar. Crackling candy came from hog killing day. Women melted sugar in cast iron, stirring slow until it turned amber and liquid, then poured it over fresh cracklings spread on a greased pan. The caramel seized around the pork, and when it cooled, it cracked into jagged pieces that were salty, sweet, smoky, and crunchy in the same bite. This was the Deep South's answer to a praline, made without pecans because pecans cost money and cracklings were free on butchering day. Kids hovered around the kitchen waiting for the pan to cool enough to touch, and the pieces vanished before supper was served. Some women added a pinch of cayenne to the sugar for heat. Others stirred in a splash of ribbon cane syrup to make it chewy instead of brittle. No two batches ever matched because no two women worked the sugar the same way, and the ones who could tell by the color alone when to pull the skillet from the fire learned it from standing beside someone who already knew. The dishes that carried the deepest roots were often the first to disappear, and Kushkush was proof. Fried before dawn in Louisiana's Black Creole households, Kushkush was coarsely ground cornmeal mixed with water, salt, and lard, cooked in a hot skillet until a crust formed, then broken apart and stirred into golden, crunchy crumbles. Eaten with milk poured over like cereal or drizzled with cane syrup, it was a breakfast that predated the Deep South itself. Food historians trace it to Senegambian millet porridge traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people who adapted to cornmeal when their native grains were gone. In the bayou parishes of southwest Louisiana, Black Creole families ate Kushkush every morning without thinking about it, until one morning, nobody made it and the skillet went cold. The women who fried it could tell by the sound when the crust was ready. That sound stopped when they did. It showed up at funerals. That's the first thing anyone in southwest Louisiana will tell you about sweet dough bread. Not the recipe, but when it appeared. A soft yeast bread enriched with cane syrup, butter, and eggs, baked in loaves and brought to the grieving wrapped in clean towels. In Black Creole communities around Opelousas and the Atchafalaya Basin, sweet dough bread was tied to mourning, homecomings, and the church kitchen where women gathered after service. The dough was mixed by hand, left to rise, punched down, and shaped with flour-dusted fingers that moved from memory. Golden, tender, carrying the faint sweetness of cane without tasting like dessert. It was comfort in the most literal sense, made by hands that had nothing else to give except flour and time. Those women are gone, and the bread left with them. Potlikker soup was not just leftover broth from a pot of greens, though that's where it started. In the oldest Black kitchens, potlikker was medicine before it was food. The liquid left from simmering collards or turnip greens with pork was rich with vitamins, iron, and fat, and grandmothers heated it in a cup for sick children, for women after childbirth, for anyone who needed strength but couldn't hold solid food. WPA, narratives from formerly enslaved people, describe potlikker as the most valued part of the meal. The greens were sustenance, but the broth was healing, carried from plantation kitchens into free households as one of the oldest continuous food traditions in the African American South. When potlikker became soup, it got onion, garlic, sometimes potato to thicken, and hunks of cornbread dropped in to soak. Sipped slow with bread, it was the quietest meal in the house and the one that meant someone was being taken care of. The women who made it never called it soup, they called it what you needed. Fried salt pork and cream gravy was Depression-era breakfast, stripped to its bones. A slab of cured pork fat, fried until it blistered, then gravy made from the drippings, flour and milk poured over biscuits. The salt pork wasn't bacon, harder, saltier, fattier, from the barrel in the pantry or the smokehouse out back. Soaked first to draw out brine, sliced thin, laid in a cold skillet that heated slowly until the fat rendered in waves. The cream gravy built from those drippings was white, thick, peppered heavy, and poured over anything that needed richness. Through the 1930s and 40s, this kept black sharecropping families alive in January when the garden was dead and the smokehouse running low. It cost almost nothing. It held you until dark. And the woman who made it stood at that stove before anyone else was awake. Muscadine jelly on hot biscuit bread was September in a jar. The muscadines grew wild across the deep south, thick-skinned, purple-black grapes hanging from vines that wrapped around fences and trees. Gathering them was family work, and the smell of crushed fruit, musky, sweet, sharp, clung to your hands for days. The grapes were boiled whole, strained through cheesecloth, and the juice cooked with sugar until it passed the sheeting test, 2 drops merging into one as they fell from the spoon, and only the women who'd done it for years could read that moment right. Sealed in mason jars, with melted paraffin wax poured over the top, a method used across the rural South long before commercial lids were affordable. The jelly-lined pantry shelves through winter, spread thick over a hot biscuit, split open and steaming, it was a taste no store-bought grape jelly has matched. The vines are still out there, heavy every fall, but the women who stood over the pot reading the spoon, their kitchens have gone quiet, and the muscadines dropped to the ground with nobody waiting underneath. Sunday, chicken and rice was the last meal of the week and the one that mattered most. A whole chicken, not parts, not boneless. The entire bird with neck and gizzard tucked inside went into a pot with onion, celery, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf, boiled until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned golden with fat and flavor. The chicken was pulled out, stripped by hand while still hot enough to burn, and the rice went into that same broth to cook, absorbing every drop of what the bird had given. Served on a plate with the pulled chicken laid over the rice and the potlikker spooned on top. It came from one animal and one pot, and it fed a family of 8 without anything left over. Through the 1950s and 60s, a whole fryer cost less than $1, and the woman who cooked it wasted nothing. The back, the neck, the wing tips, all of it went into the broth because that's where the flavor lived. You could follow every step she took. You could use the same pot. It still wouldn't taste the way. Hers did because the recipe was never the secret. She was.